Maria worked at the fancy Sterling Grill, a place where rich people came to enjoy expensive meals. It wasn't the kind of restaurant where normal folks like her would eat. Every night she watched as people spent more on one dinner than she earned in 2 days. Life hadn't been easy for Maria. At just 23, she carried the weight of caring for her younger brother, Luis. Their parents had died in a car crash 3 years ago, leaving them alone with a small insurance payment that didn't last long. Maria had dropped out of college to work full-time while Luis finished high school. "Order up for table 12, called Chen, the head chef. Maria balanced the heavy plates on her arm, a $75 steak that would probably be half-eaten, like most nights. She placed the dish in front of the man at table 12. He barely looked up from his phone, giving a slight nod. Maria recognized him from the local business magazine. James Montgomery, real estate developer, worth millions. His company had recently built the luxury apartments downtown that were changing the neighborhood. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Maria asked with her practiced smile. "Just the check when I'm done," he replied, finally glancing up. His eyes were tired despite his expensive suit and perfect haircut. Something about him seemed lonely. Throughout her shift, Maria kept an eye on table 12. Mr. Montgomery ate slowly, taking business calls between bites. As she had predicted, he left nearly half of his steak untouched when he signaled for the check. Maria thought about her empty fridge at home. Luis was a growing teenager who seemed always hungry. The leftover food that got thrown away every night at the restaurant could feed them for days. "You're crazy," whispered Danny, another server who noticed Maria staring at the half-eaten steak. "Rich people don't give handouts." But something pushed Maria forward as Mr. Montgomery signed the credit card receipt. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the memory of her mother saying, "Closed mouths don't get fed." "Excuse me, sir," Maria said, her heart hammering in her chest. Her palms felt sweaty, and she clasped them together to stop the trembling. "I know this is unusual, but may I have your leftovers, sir?" The words hung in the air. Maria immediately regretted speaking. She would surely get fired. What had she been thinking? Mr. Montgomery looked up from his phone, clearly surprised by her request. For a moment, he just stared at her, and Maria prepared herself for anger or disgust. But then something unexpected happened. Their eyes met, really met, for the first time. Maria's eyes were deep brown, honest and determined despite her embarrassment. His were gray-blue, suddenly alive with curiosity. "I'm sorry," Maria said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" "Why?" he interrupted, his voice neither angry nor judgmental. "Just curious." Maria hesitated. The truth seemed too personal, too raw to share with a wealthy stranger. But something in his gaze made her continue. "My brother and I, we're on our own. He's still in high school and he's always hungry. I hate seeing good food go to waste when we—" She stopped, feeling her cheeks burn with shame. To her surprise, Mr. Montgomery pushed his plate toward her. "Please take it." Maria blinked, not quite believing what she was hearing. "Thank you, but I can't just—" "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. His tone was gentle but firm. Maria glanced nervously at her manager, who was busy at the front desk and hadn't noticed the unusual interaction. "I'll get in trouble." "Just for a minute," Mr. Montgomery insisted. "I'm curious about something." Against her better judgment, Maria slid into the chair. The restaurant was quieting down as the evening crowd thinned. "Maybe her manager wouldn't notice, James Montgomery," he said, extending his hand. "Maria Diaz," she replied, shaking it briefly. "Tell me." "Maria," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you always ask strangers for their leftovers?" Maria shook her head quickly. "No, never. I don't know what came over me. It's just been a tough month and—" She looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize for asking for what you need," James said. "That takes courage." His response surprised her. Maria had expected judgment, not understanding. She studied his face, noticing the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of stress despite his wealth. "How long have you worked here?" James asked. "Almost 2 years. Since my parents died." Something flickered in James's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or sympathy. "And your brother? How old is he?" "Luis is 17. Smart kid. Gets straight A's despite everything." James nodded slowly, as if processing this information carefully. "I was raised by my sister after our parents died." "I was about your brother's age then." Maria hadn't expected this wealthy man to share anything personal with her. The revelation created an unexpected bridge between them. "What happened to your sister?" Maria asked before she could stop herself. A shadow crossed James's face. "She passed away 5 years ago. Cancer." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "She had a daughter once, but had to give her up for adoption when times were tough. I've been trying to find my niece ever since." "I'm sorry," Maria said softly, meaning it. James shrugged slightly, as if trying to dismiss old pain. "Life is strange. Sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them." The moment felt heavy with meaning that Maria couldn't quite grasp. Something about this man seemed familiar, though she knew they had never met before. "Where did you grow up?" James asked suddenly. "Here in the city. West Side mainly. My mom was from New Mexico originally." James stared at her intently. "New Mexico? What was her name before she married?" "Sanchez. Elena Sanchez. Why?" James's face went completely still. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away as he looked at Maria with new intensity. She noticed his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his water glass. That was my sister's married name," he said quietly. "Elena Sanchez Montgomery." Maria felt the world tilt sideways. "No, that's impossible. My mom was Elena Sanchez Diaz. She was married to my dad, Roberto." James nodded slowly. "Before that, she was married briefly when she was very young, to a man named Thomas Montgomery." Maria's mind raced, trying to make sense of this. Her mother had never mentioned a previous marriage, but there had been many things her parents didn't talk about. "Did your mother ever mention giving up a child?" James asked gently. Maria started to shake her head, then stopped. There had been a box of her mother's things that Maria had found after the funeral, letters and old photos. One photo showed her mother much younger, looking tired but smiling weakly, holding a baby. There was writing on the back that Maria couldn't fully make out. Something about hope and better life. "I think maybe she did," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. James reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, worn photo. He handed it to Maria. It showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Maria's mother holding a newborn baby. "That's my sister," James said, "with her daughter the day before she gave her up for adoption." Maria stared at the photo, then back at James. The restaurant around them faded into a blur as an impossible truth began to take shape. "The baby would be 28 now," James said. "My sister named her Hope." Maria felt a chill run through her body. Hope was her middle name. Maria Hope Diaz. She had always thought it was just a pretty name her parents liked. "This is crazy," she whispered, her hands shaking. "It can't be." But as she looked into James's eyes, she saw her own questions reflected back, along with something that felt like recognition. A connection that neither of them could explain but both somehow felt. "I think we have a lot to talk about," James said softly. "And I'd like to meet your brother if that's okay." Maria nodded slowly, unable to find words. If what they both suspected was true, then this chance encounter, this simple request for leftovers, had just changed everything. And as Maria looked into the eyes of the man who might be her uncle, she realized that sometimes the miracles we need most come disguised as ordinary moments of courage. The busy restaurant seemed to freeze around Maria as she stood there, heart pounding in her chest. The words had already left her mouth before she could think better of it. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" She immediately wished she could take them back. James Montgomery looked up from his phone, startled. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face, then something else, curiosity rather than offense. Their eyes met across the small distance between them, and Maria felt an odd sensation as if time itself had slowed down. "I'm so sorry," Maria said quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. That was completely out of line. "I shouldn't have." "Please," James interrupted, his voice softer than she expected. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down for a moment." Maria glanced nervously toward her manager, Lisa, who was busy sorting through reservation cards at the front desk. "I really can't. I'll lose my job." "Just for a minute," James insisted. "I'd like to understand." Against her better judgment, Maria slid into the seat across from the wealthy businessman. Up close, she noticed details she hadn't before. The slight shadows under his eyes despite his perfect suit. The way his fingers tapped the table edge with a nervous energy that didn't match his powerful appearance. "Nobody's ever asked me that before," James said, studying her face. "Why did you?" Maria considered lying, making up some story that would sound less desperate than the truth. But something in his direct gaze made her decide on honesty. I have a brother at home. He's 17 and growing so fast that feeding him is like trying to fill a bottomless pit. She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I saw you were finished and there's so much food left. At the end of the night, it all gets thrown away while people like me go hungry. She looked down at her hands. I'm sorry. It was inappropriate. When she looked up, James was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. What's your name? He asked. Maria. Maria Diaz. I'm James Montgomery. He pushed his plate slightly toward her. And yes, you may have my leftovers. Maria didn't move. Thank you, but I think I've already crossed too many lines. My manager would definitely fire me if I took food from a customer's plate. James nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. He picked up his napkin and carefully wrapped the remaining steak and potatoes. Then I'll just take this to go and perhaps you can accept it as a gift outside. Maria shook her head in disbelief. Why would you do that? Why would you help me? James paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. There's something about you that seems familiar. I can't quite place it. His eyes, a clear gray blue, searched hers again. Besides, I remember what it's like to be hungry. This statement, delivered so matter-of-factly, surprised Maria. She'd assumed someone like James Montgomery had always lived a life of privilege. You do? A small, sad smile touched his lips. Before all this, he gestured vaguely to his expensive watch and tailored suit. I was just a kid from the South Side with 2 small shoes and a sister who worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. Maria couldn't hide her surprise. But I've seen you in the business pages. Your company just built those luxury apartments downtown. Life can change, James said simply, sometimes dramatically. He leaned forward slightly. But you never really forget where you came from. At least you shouldn't. Their conversation was interrupted by Lisa, Maria's manager, approaching with a concerned expression. Is everything all right here, Mr. Montgomery? She asked, giving Maria a pointed look that clearly said, Get back to work. Everything is excellent, James replied smoothly. In fact, I'd like to compliment you on your staff. Maria has been particularly attentive this evening. Lisa's stern expression softened slightly. I'm glad to hear that. Maria, table 6 needs their check. Right away, Maria said, rising quickly. She gave James an uncertain look. Thank you for any understanding. As she turned to go, James spoke again. Actually, one more thing. Could I get a box for this? And perhaps your card, Ms. Diaz. Maria froze. My card? Yes, James said casually, as if his request was perfectly normal. I'm always looking for people with initiative for my company. Someone who isn't afraid to ask direct questions might be valuable. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. Of course, Mr. Montgomery, I'll get you a takeout container right away. She hurried off, clearly impressed by this unexpected development. Left alone briefly again, Maria looked at James suspiciously. I don't have business cards. I'm just a server. Then write your number down, James suggested, sliding a pen and his napkin toward her. I mean it about the job opportunity. No strings attached, Maria hesitated. This whole situation felt surreal. Men like James Montgomery didn't offer jobs to servers who asked for their leftovers. There had to be a catch. Why? She asked directly. Why would you offer me anything? James seemed to appreciate her directness. Intuition, maybe. I've learned to trust my instincts about people. It's how I've built my business. He paused. Or maybe it's because when I looked into your eyes, I saw someone who reminds me of my sister. She had that same determined look. Something in his tone made Maria believe him, despite how unusual the situation was. She took the pen and quickly wrote her number on the napkin. I can't promise anything, James added as she slid it back to him, but I'll have my HR department contact you about positions that might suit your skills. Lisa returned with a takeout container, and James carefully packed up the remaining food. Maria took this as her cue to return to work, still dazed by the strange turn of events. Thank you again for excellent service, James said formally as he signed his bill, leaving a tip that made Maria's eyes widen. As he stood to leave, he looked at her one last time. You know, my sister used to say that the difference between success and failure is often just having the courage to ask for what you need. He smiled slightly. I'm glad you asked, Maria Diaz. With that, he left, taking the takeout container with him. Maria watched him go, certain she would never see him again despite his talk of job opportunities. Men like him made empty promises all the time. When she went outside after her shift ended 3 hours later, she was shocked to find the takeout container sitting on the hood of her old Honda, with a business card tucked under it. The card was simple but elegant. James Montgomery, CEO, Montgomery Enterprises, with a phone number and email address. Maria picked up the container, still warm, as if it had just been placed there. Beside her car stood a security guard from the restaurant. "Guy in a fancy suit asked me to make sure this stayed on your car," the guard explained. "Gave me $20 to watch it. Said to tell you, your brother shouldn't go hungry tonight." Maria stood there holding the container, feeling the weight of the food inside, and the unexpected kindness from a stranger. She had no way of knowing that the business card in her hand would change her life forever, or that the strange connection she'd felt when their eyes met wasn't just her imagination. As she drove home that night, Maria kept thinking about the way James had looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with a kind of recognition she couldn't explain. She had no idea that across town in his penthouse apartment, James Montgomery was making a phone call to his private investigator, asking him to look into the background of a server named Maria Diaz, whose eyes had awakened a memory he'd been chasing for years. "I think I found her. Frank," James said into the phone, looking out at the city lights. "I think I finally found my niece." The question that had stopped time in that restaurant was just the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined. A story that had actually begun decades before, with a young mother's difficult choice and a promise to find her child someday. Maria sat across from James Montgomery in a quiet corner of a cafe the following week, nervously spinning her cup of coffee. She hadn't expected him to actually call, but 3 days after their strange encounter at the restaurant, his assistant had contacted her to schedule this meeting. "I appreciate you coming," James said, his voice calm but with an undertone of something Maria couldn't quite place. Excitement, anxiety? "I know this must seem unusual." "That's an understatement," Maria replied with a small laugh. She'd dressed in her nicest outfit, a simple blue blouse and black pants that she usually saved for job interviews. Next to James's perfectly tailored suit, she still felt underdressed. "I meant what I said about a job opportunity," James began, "but there's something else I'd like to discuss first, if that's all right." Maria nodded cautiously. She'd been wondering what the catch was. Rich people didn't just offer jobs to random servers who asked for leftovers. "Could you tell me a bit about your family?" James asked, his fingers lightly tapping the table in what Maria now recognized as a nervous habit. "Your parents, where you grew up, that sort of thing." The question seemed odd, but Maria decided to answer honestly. Something about this man made her trust him, despite her usual caution around strangers. "There's not much to tell. I grew up here in the city. My parents were good people, hardworking, kind. Mom was from New Mexico originally, and Dad grew up in Puerto Rico. They met here, got married, had me and then Luis 5 years later." She paused, swallowing the familiar lump in her throat. "They died in a car accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver hit them on the highway." James's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm very sorry to hear that. It must have been incredibly difficult for you and your brother." "It was," Maria said simply. She didn't mention the crushing medical bills from her parents' brief time in the hospital before they died, or how quickly their modest savings had disappeared, leaving her to drop out of college to support Luis. "But we're managing." "You mentioned your mother was from New Mexico," James said carefully. "Do you know much about her life there, before she met your father?" Maria frowned slightly, finding the question strange. "Not really. Mom didn't talk much about those days. I know she had a tough childhood. Her parents died when she was young, and she was raised by relatives who weren't particularly kind." She hesitated, then added, "I found some old letters after she died. Seems like she came to the city when she was just 18, trying to start fresh." James nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Was your mother's name Elena?" Maria's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Yes, Elena Sanchez Diaz. How did you know that?" Instead of answering, James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, placing it carefully on the table between them. "Is this her?" Maria's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the photo. It showed a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with familiar dark eyes and a hesitant smile. She was standing in front of an old apartment building, arms crossed as if hugging herself against the cold. "That's her," Maria whispered, staring at the image of her mother, so much younger than she'd ever seen her in family photos. "Where did you get this?" James took a deep breath. "That photo was taken by my sister, Catherine Montgomery. She and Elena were friends, more than friends, really. They were like family to each other when neither of them had anyone else." Maria looked up, confused. "I don't understand. My mom never mentioned anyone named Catherine." "She might have called her Katie," James said softly. "That's what everyone called my sister." A distant memory stirred in Maria's mind, her mother occasionally mentioning a friend named Katie when telling stories about her early days in the city. But the connection still didn't make sense. "How do you know all this?" Maria asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why are you asking about my mother?" James clasped his hands together on the table, as if steadying himself. "Because I believe there's a connection between us that neither of us knew existed until now." He paused. "Maria, has anyone ever told you that you look exactly like Catherine?" Maria set the photo down, suddenly uneasy. "No, I wouldn't know. I've never seen a picture of your sister." James reached into his pocket again and produced another photograph. This one showed a young woman who looked remarkably similar to the younger version of Elena. The same high cheekbones, the same shape of the eyes. But this woman had lighter hair and a more confident stance. "This is Catherine," James said. "My sister." Maria stared at the photo, a strange feeling washing over her. The resemblance between this woman and her own mother was striking enough. But there was something else. Something about the shape of the woman's face that seemed oddly familiar from Maria's own mirror. "I don't understand what this has to do with me," she said, though a part of her was beginning to suspect. James looked directly into her eyes, the same way he had that night in the restaurant, as if searching for something. Catherine had a baby when she was very young. She wasn't in a position to raise a child. She was only 20, working 3 jobs to support herself and me after our parents died. The baby's father was gone before Catherine even knew she was pregnant. His voice grew quieter. She made the hardest decision of her life and gave her daughter up for adoption. Maria felt her heart begin to race. "Mr. Montgomery." "James, please." "James," she corrected herself, "what exactly are you suggesting?" "I believe Elena Sanchez, your mother, adopted my sister's baby," he said gently. "I believe that baby was you, Maria." The cafe seemed to tilt around her. "That's impossible. My parents would have told me if I was adopted." "Would they?" James asked. "Many parents of that generation believed it was better not to tell children they were adopted. They thought it might make them feel less secure, less loved." Maria shook her head firmly. "There's no way. I have my birth certificate. It lists Elena and Roberto Diaz as my parents." "An amended birth certificate," James suggested. "It was common practice. The original would have been sealed by the court." Maria stood up suddenly, nearly knocking over her coffee. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is crazy." "My parents were my parents." James remained calm. "I understand this is shocking. I'm not asking you to believe me right now, but please sit down. Let me explain why I think this might be true." After a moment, Maria slowly sank back into her chair. "Go ahead," she said coldly. "When Catherine gave up her baby, she made me promise that someday when I was in a position to help, I would try to find her daughter and make sure she was okay." James's voice grew thick with emotion. "I've been looking for years, but private adoptions from that era are difficult to trace. All I knew was that the baby went to a couple with the last name Diaz," he continued. "Catherine died 5 years ago. Cancer. Her last words to me were about her daughter, hoping that she'd had a good life. A happy life." James looked down at his hands. "I never stopped looking. When I saw you that night in the restaurant, something about your eyes, they're exactly like Katie's." Maria's mind was racing. Could it possibly be true? There had always been little things that didn't quite add up. How she was taller than both her parents, how neither of them had the slight wave in their hair that she had. But being adopted? By a woman who had been friends with her birth mother? "If what you're saying is true," Maria said slowly, "then my mom, Elena, she knew who my birth mother was. She would have had to know." James nodded. "I believe they arranged it privately. Catherine told me she'd found a good home for the baby with people she trusted. She never gave me names, I think to protect everyone's privacy, but she said her friend would love the baby as her own. Maria remembered the box of her mother's things she'd found after the funeral. There had been letters she hadn't fully read, old photos she'd set aside for someday when it wouldn't hurt so much to look at them. I need time to process this, she said finally. I can't just take your word for something that changes my whole identity. Of course, James agreed immediately. I don't expect you to. In fact, I'd be concerned if you did. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, different from the one he'd left on her car. This is the contact information for a lab that does DNA testing. If you're willing, we could find out for sure. Maria took the card automatically, still feeling like she was in some kind of dream. And what if it's true? What do you want from me? James's expression softened. I don't want anything from you, Maria. Catherine made me promise to find her daughter to make sure she was all right. That's all? He paused. But I'd like the chance to know my niece if you're open to that. And I'd like to help you and your brother if I can. Maria thought about Luis, about their tiny apartment and the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, about her abandoned college dreams and Luis's hopes for university next year. The job offer, she said suddenly. Was that real? Or just an excuse to talk to me about this? It was real, James assured her. My company is always looking for people with determination and integrity. Those qualities are much harder to find than degrees or experience. He smiled slightly. Though I'm happy to help with college too, if that's what you want. Maria stood up again, more carefully this time. I need to go. I need to think. James nodded, remaining seated. I understand. Take all the time you need. He hesitated, then added. Maria stood outside Montgomery Enterprises, a gleaming glass tower that seemed to touch the clouds. 3 weeks had passed since her conversation with James at the cafe. 3 weeks of sleepless nights of digging through her mother's old belongings, of questioning everything she thought she knew about herself. She'd found the letters in a faded blue box, tucked away in the storage unit, where they kept the things they couldn't bear to part with after their parents died. Letters from someone named Catherine to her mother, spanning years. In one, dated just before Maria's birth, Catherine had written, I know my hope will be loved by you as if she were your own. There is no greater gift you could give me than this. The DNA test results had arrived yesterday in a plain white envelope. Maria had stared at it for hours before finally opening it. Now, as she pushed through the revolving doors into the cool lobby of the skyscraper, those results felt like a weight in her purse. Maria Diaz for James Montgomery, she told the receptionist. I have an appointment. The woman nodded and made a quick call. Within minutes, a young assistant appeared to escort Maria to the elevator. They rode in silence to the top floor, where the doors opened directly into a spacious waiting area. He's expecting you, the assistant said, gesturing toward double doors at the end of the hall. Maria's heart hammered as she walked toward them. When she reached the doors, she took a deep breath and knocked. Come in, called James's voice from inside. The office was simpler than she'd expected, tasteful but not ostentatious. With large windows offering a panoramic view of the city below, James stood as she entered, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Thank you for coming, he said. Please have a seat. Maria sat in one of the chairs facing his desk but didn't speak immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse and removed the envelope, placing it between them. I got the results, she said finally. James looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. And, you were right, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. According to the test, we share DNA consistent with an uncle-niece relationship. Catherine Montgomery was my biological mother. James closed his eyes briefly, emotions washing over his face. When he opened them again, they shone with unshed tears. Thank you for telling me, he said quietly. For doing the test at all, Maria nodded. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, denial, anger, confusion, and finally, a strange sense of peace. I found letters, she said, from Catherine to my mother, to Elena. They were friends from when they both worked at a diner downtown before I was born. Catherine wrote about her pregnancy, about her decision, about choosing Elena and Roberto to raise her baby. James nodded. That sounds like Katie. She was always thoughtful, always planning ahead, even in crisis. There was one thing I still don't understand, Maria said, leaning forward slightly. If they arranged this between them, why didn't my parents ever tell me I was adopted? And why didn't Catherine ever come see me growing up? The letters stopped after I was born. James sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. I can't know for certain, but I have a theory. He gestured to a photo on his desk, a younger version of himself with his arm around a smiling woman who looked remarkably like Maria. After Catherine gave you up, she struggled. The decision broke something in her. She started drinking, made some bad decisions. By the time she pulled herself together, years had passed. And my parents? Maria pressed. Perhaps they intended to tell you when you were older. Or perhaps they worried that knowing might make you feel less theirs. James's expression grew thoughtful. People didn't talk about adoption the way they do now. Many thought it was better for the child not to know. Maria considered this. In the box with the letters, she'd found a journal her mother had kept. In it, Elena had written about her fears that someday the truth would come out, and she would lose the daughter she loved more than life itself. Reading those words had brought Maria to tears, understanding for the first time her mother's fear that love might not be enough. I brought something else, Maria said, reaching into her purse again. She pulled out a small photograph and handed it to James. I found this in my mother's things. James took the photo carefully. It showed 3 people, a younger Elena, a man who must have been Roberto, and between them, Catherine. All 3 were smiling, arms linked, standing on what looked like the roof of an apartment building. I've never seen this before, James said, his voice thick with emotion. They look happy. The back says, the day we became a family, and the date is about a month before I was born, Maria explained. I think they really did love each other, the 3 of them. They created a family that day. James studied the photo for a long moment before handing it back. Thank you for sharing this with me. It means more than you know. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history filling the room. Finally, James spoke again, his tone lighter. So now that the mystery is solved, I'd like to ask about your future. Have you considered my job offer? Maria had in fact thought a lot about it. The position was in community outreach for Montgomery Enterprises Charitable Foundation. Good pay, flexible hours that would allow her to return to college, and work that actually mattered. I have, she said carefully, but I'm concerned that people will think I only got the job because we're related. James smiled. Anyone who works with you for a week will know better. Besides, nepotism would be hiring an unqualified relative as my personal assistant with a 6-figure salary. This is a real job that happens to be a good fit for your skills and experience. Maria couldn't help but smile back. Over the past weeks, as she'd processed the shock of her discovery, she'd also found herself drawn to the idea of knowing James better. He was her only link to the mother she'd never known. There's something else, she said. Luis doesn't know any of this yet. I wanted to be sure before I turned his world upside down, too. James nodded. Of course. He's your brother regardless of biology. This affects him, too. That's just it, Maria said, leaning forward. According to the DNA test, there's no biological relationship between us. But he's still my brother in every way that matters. I've raised him since our parents died. I need to know that any relationship between you and me includes him. Absolutely, James said without hesitation. Family is family, Maria. Blood is just one way people become connected. Luis is your brother, which makes him my family, too. The certainty in his voice eased something in Maria's chest that had been tight since she'd opened the test results. In that case, she said, I'd like to accept the job and, she hesitated, I'd like to learn more about Catherine. About my birth mother. James's face lit up. I'd love to tell you about her. She was extraordinary, smart, determined, kind. She loved music and could dance like nobody's business. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small album. I've gathered some photos and memories whenever you're ready. Maria realized that James had been preparing for this moment, hoping for it but not presuming it would come. The thought warmed her. There's one more thing, James said, suddenly looking nervous. I'd like to meet Luis when you're ready. And if it's not too forward, I'd like to help with his college tuition. Maria started to protest, her pride flaring up instinctively. Please, James continued before she could speak. I've spent 15 years searching for Catherine's daughter. Let me do this, not just for you and Luis, but for her. She would have wanted it. Maria thought about the stack of college brochures on Luis's desk, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about studying engineering, and the dwindling hope they'd had of making it happen. We can discuss it, she said finally. But first, let's take things one step at a time. Dinner, maybe? You could come over and meet Luis, see our place. It's not fancy, but I'd be honored, James interrupted, his voice sincere. As they worked out the details, Maria felt a strange sense of coming home, not to a place she'd been before, but to a truth she hadn't known she was missing. The tycoon who had looked into her eyes that night in the restaurant hadn't just seen a server asking for leftovers. He'd seen a piece of his past, a promise kept, a miracle unfolding. And she had seen, though she didn't know it then, the beginning of a new chapter for them all. When she left the office that day, Maria stepped into the elevator feeling lighter than she had in years. The truth once feared had become a gift, connecting her not just to a past she hadn't known, but to a future suddenly rich with possibilities. 1 year later, Maria stood in front of the full-length mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The elegant black graduation gown fell in neat folds around her, the honor cords draped over her shoulders, adding splashes of gold and blue. Outside her bedroom door, she could hear the excited voices of Luis and James discussing the merits of different engineering programs. "You can come in," she called, smoothing down the front of her gown. "I'm decent." The door swung open, and both men entered with matching expressions of pride. Luis, now 18 and nearly as tall as James, whistled appreciatively. "Look at you, college graduate," he said, grinning. "Summa cum laude and everything. Mom and Dad would have been so proud." "They would," James agreed softly, his eyes a bit misty as he looked at Maria. Elena and Roberto raised an incredible daughter. Maria felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her parents. In the year since discovering her adoption, she had come to understand that she was the product of not just 2 but 5 people who had loved her: her birth mother Catherine, her uncle James, and the parents who had raised her as their own. "I wish they could be here today," she said, touching the small locket around her neck. Inside were tiny photos, Elena and Roberto on one side, Catherine on the other. "They are," Luis said simply, "just not in a way we can see." James checked his watch. "The car will be here in 20 minutes. Are you ready for your big day, graduate?" Maria nodded, taking a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." The past year had transformed all their lives. Maria had returned to college full-time, finishing her business degree with the highest honors while working part-time at the Montgomery Foundation. Luis had graduated high school and been accepted to the engineering program of his dreams with a full scholarship, partly from the university and partly from a fund James had established in Catherine's name. And James had gained the family he'd been searching for since his sister's death: Sunday dinners at Maria and Luis's new apartment, holiday celebrations, ordinary weeknight phone calls just to check in. The wealthy businessman who had once seemed so isolated now had photos of Maria's graduation ceremony displayed proudly on his desk, next to pictures of Luis winning the regional science fair. The doorbell rang, and Luis bounded out to answer it. "Car's here," he called, "and it's one of those fancy stretch ones." James shrugged apologetically when Maria raised an eyebrow at him. "It's not every day my niece graduates at the top of her class. I thought we should arrive in style." As they made their way to the car, Maria thought about how much had changed since that night at the Sterling Grill when she'd gathered her courage to ask for leftover food. She'd been so desperate then, so afraid of what the future held. Now she walked tall in her graduation gown, with a bright future ahead and a family that had expanded in ways she could never have imagined. The ceremony was beautiful, held in the university's grand auditorium with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. When Maria's name was called, she could hear Luis whistling and James clapping louder than anyone else in the crowd. As she crossed the stage to receive her diploma, she glanced at them, Luis recording everything on his phone, James beaming with pride, and felt a surge of gratitude for this second chance they'd all been given. After the ceremony, they gathered outside with other graduates and their families for photos. One of Maria's classmates stopped to congratulate her. "Is that James Montgomery?" the girl whispered, eyeing James with awe. "The James Montgomery? What's he doing at your graduation?" Maria smiled. "He's my uncle." The words still felt new on her tongue, but they were true in all the ways that mattered. James was her mother's brother, her family by blood and by choice. "No way," the girl exclaimed. "I didn't know you were related to the Montgomerys. That explains how you landed that amazing job at the foundation." Maria shook her head. "Actually, I got the job before either of us knew we were related, and I'm not a Montgomery. I'm a Diaz. Always will be." She said this last part loudly enough for James to hear as he approached. He smiled, understanding in his eyes. "Ready for the next stop?" he asked. Maria nodded. They had one more important place to visit before the celebration dinner James had arranged. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon sun, birds singing in the trees that lined the paths. Maria, still in her graduation gown, carried a bouquet of lilies as they made their way to her parents' grave. Luis walked slightly ahead, knowing the way by heart, while James followed a respectful distance behind. When they reached the headstone that bore both Elena and Roberto's names, Maria knelt and placed the flowers carefully at its base. "Hi, Mom, hi, Dad," she said softly. "I graduated today, just like I promised." She touched the stone gently. "I learned about Catherine this year, about being adopted. I want you to know it doesn't change anything. You're still my parents, still the people who made me who I am." Luis knelt beside her, placing his hand on her shoulder. "I got into State University's engineering program," he told the stone. "Full ride. No more worrying about how we'll pay for it." Maria glanced back at James, who stood watching them with a mixture of respect and emotion on his face. She gestured for him to join them. "This is James," she told the headstone. "Catherine's brother, my uncle. He's been taking good care of us, just like you would have wanted." She paused, then added, "I think you would have liked him, Mom. He has your kind heart." James knelt on her other side, placing a small stone on top of the headstone in a gesture of respect. "Thank you," he said simply to the stone, "for giving my niece a wonderful life, for loving her as your own. Catherine would have been so grateful, and so am I." They stayed a few minutes longer in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they finally rose to leave, Maria felt a sense of completion, of circles closing, and new ones beginning. That evening, the ballroom of the Grand Hotel was transformed for the Montgomery Foundation's annual gala. Tables covered in white linen surrounded a small stage, while waitstaff in formal attire served an elegant dinner to the city's business leaders, philanthropists, and community advocates. Maria had changed from her graduation gown into a simple but elegant black dress. She sat at the main table with Luis and James, still somewhat amazed to find herself in such surroundings. A year ago, she had been serving meals to people like these. Now she was being introduced as the Foundation's new director of youth programs. As dinner concluded, James rose and made his way to the podium. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "The Montgomery Foundation was established 15 years ago with a simple mission: to help young people overcome obstacles and achieve their dreams. Tonight, I want to share a story that embodies everything our foundation stands for." Maria felt her cheeks warm as James glanced in her direction. A year ago, a young woman working as a server in a restaurant gathered her courage and asked a simple question: "May I have your leftovers, sir?" James paused, allowing the words to sink in. That question led to an extraordinary discovery. This young woman was my niece, the daughter of my late sister Catherine, who I had been searching for since Catherine's death. A murmur ran through the crowd. Most knew James as a private man who rarely spoke about his personal life. But the miracle wasn't just finding my niece after all these years, James continued. The miracle was discovering the kind of person she had become: determined, compassionate, brilliant. Today she graduated summa cum laude while working for our foundation, where she's already developed programs that have helped hundreds of young people in our city. He gestured toward Maria. "I'd like to introduce you to Maria Diaz, my niece and the new director of our youth programs. Maria, would you join me?" Feeling slightly dazed, Maria rose and made her way to the stage. The spotlight felt warm on her face as she took her place beside James. "The lesson I've learned this year is that miracles happen in unexpected ways," James told the crowd. "Sometimes they start with a simple question asked in a moment of courage. Maria has taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, about choices we make every day to care for one another. He turned to Maria. Would you like to say a few words? Maria hadn't prepared a speech, but as she looked out at the crowd, she knew exactly what she wanted to say. She stepped to the microphone, her voice clear and confident. A year ago, I was desperate enough to ask a stranger for his leftovers, she began. I was working multiple jobs trying to keep a roof over my brother's head and food on our table. I never imagined that simple question would change my life. She glanced at James, then continued. But the real miracle wasn't finding my birth family or getting this amazing job. The real miracle was discovering that asking for help isn't a weakness, it's an act of courage. Every day at the foundation I meet young people who just need someone to believe in them, to give them a chance. Maria looked directly at the wealthy donors seated before her. That's what I'm asking of you tonight. Not leftovers, but your wholehearted support for young people who just need an opportunity to show what they're capable of. The room erupted in applause as she finished. James embraced her, whispering, Your mothers would be so proud of you. All of them. As they returned to their table, Luis gave her a thumbs up. Around them, people were already writing checks, inspired by Theg.